So we'll start out with a few monitoring progress questions. So please go ahead and get started with monitoring question number 6. Work on monitoring progress number 7 before you look at the next slide. This graph is going to be the most complicated one of all that we are going to graph. So let us talk about first what is the amplitude. So the amplitude is going to be 2. The period is going to be 2 pi divided by 2/3, which is 2 pi multiplied by 3/2. So let me take that little piece off, is 3/2. And then that's going to give us 3 pi for the period. So we are going to have x and y, and we'll have 3 pi at the end and negative 3 pi at the other end, and then we are going to have 0 in the middle in our table. Now let's talk about the transformations. So the transformations are reflect over x-axis. Then we have a vertical stretch by a scale factor of 2. Then we have a horizontal stretch by a scale factor of 3/2. And then we are translating right by pi/2. So let us go ahead and find the points on the graph or on the x-axis. So here we are going to do 1/2 times 3 pi. So that's going to give us 3 pi/2. Then here we are going to have 1/4 times 3 pi. So that's going to be 3 pi/4. And here we'll have 3/4 times 3 pi, which is going to give us 9 pi/4. So now we'll go into the negative direction. So it's negative 3 pi/4, negative 3 pi/2, and negative 9 pi/4. So we can start labeling here. So we are going to say this is our 3 pi/4. Then this is our 3 pi/2. Then here is our 9 pi/4. And then here is our 3 pi. And so on the center we have 0, and then we have negative 3 pi/4, negative 3 pi/2, negative 9 pi/4, and negative 3 pi. So since we are graphing a sine graph, we are going to make our little circle on the right here. So here is 1, 0. So let me change that. So here is our 1, 0. And here we have our 0, 1, our negative 1, 0. And here we have our 0, negative 1 point. So from here, I'm going to make my little curve here for the sine curve. And we start with the 0 point, then the maximum, then 0, then minimum, and 0 point. So let's go ahead and decide where we are here. So we are going to have at 0, we'll have 0. and then at 3/4 or 3 pi over 4, we are going to have 1, and 3 pi over 2 is 0, 9 pi over 4 is -1, and then back to 0. So in the opposite direction, we go to -1, 0, 1, and 0. So these are the main points, and these are the points that is my starting with 0, then going to the maximum, then going to back to 0, going to the minimum, and going to the x-intercept 0 again. Okay, so from here, we are going to have to graph this original function. So let's go ahead and graph this one first. And this is going to be, let's see, we are going to have, let's make this one to be 1, and let's make this one to be 2. And then here we'll have -1 and -2. So we are going to graph our original graph. So we start with 0, then we go to 1, then we go back to 0, -1, 0, and going in the other direction. So here is our sine graph that already has our horizontal stretch in it. So let's label this graph, and we are going to label this y equals sine 2/3 of x. So for the next step, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, let's see if I can get another color. I'm actually going to graph -2 times sine 2/3 x. So that means first I am going to stretch by scale factor of 2, and then I'm going to reflect. So the point 0, 0, if I stretch it is still 0, 0, and if I reflect it is still 0, 0. So that means this point is going to stay where it is. So we are going to put that there. Now if I go to the next point, if I stretch it by 2, I get here, but then I need to reflect it, so I will get down here. So I'm going to put the point down there. The 0 or the x-intercept stays the same place. Now if I take this point right here and stretch it by 2, then I reflect it, I will land over here. So I'm going to put the point there, and again go back to 0. And then on the other direction, I am just going to go ahead and continue the pattern. So here is our graph that is y equals, so this graph, the green one, is y equals -2 times sine 2/3 of x. So lastly, what we have to do is we have to move the graph pi over 2 to the right. So I will set up a little proportion for myself. I know that the period is 3 pi, and that represents 8 squares. So this is the period, and this is the number of squares. So what I want to figure out is pi over 2 is then how many squares. So that means it's going to be an x number of squares, which I don't know. So we are going to cross multiply. So we have 3 pi times x will equal to 8 times pi over 2. So if I have 8 times pi over 2, so if I have 3 pi x, that's going to give me 4 pi squares. So if I divide both sides by 3 pi, I will end up getting x equals 4/3 squares. So that means a pi over 2 is going to be 4/3 squares, so 1 1/3 squares. So that means I need to move my graph 1 1/3 squares. So I'm going to start with, for example, if I start with this point right here, the 0, 0, I'm going to have to move it 1 square and another third square. Then if I go to the next point, which is this one, I move it 1 square and another third. So I move this 1 1/3 squares. And then I'm going to go here and move it 1 1/3 squares. Then I'm going to go here and move it 1 1/3 squares. And then the last point right here. So I am going to go to the left side, and again I move every point on the graph 1 1/3 squares to the right. So 1 1/3 and 1 1/3. So now I can actually create my graph. And this is going to be my final graph for this particular function. And this red graph is going to be having the equation of g of x equals -2 times sine 2/3 x minus pi over 2. So let's go ahead and find our zeros first. So here I'm going to write zeros. So our first zero appears to be right here. So that means 3 pi, -3 pi, plus pi over 2. So that's going to be -6 pi over 2 plus pi over 2. So that's -5 pi over 2, which will give me here -5 pi over 2 and 0. The next zero is going to be, let me go ahead and show you, it will be here. So that's going to be -3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2. So that's going to be -pi. So that will be -pi and 0. And let me put semicolon here. So the next zero is going to be at pi over 2 because we moved from 0 to pi over 2. So that's going to be pi over 2, 0. And then the following 0 is going to be 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2, which is 4 pi over 2. So that's going to give me pi, 2 pi actually. So that's going to give me 2 pi and 0. And then the last 0 is going to be 3 pi plus pi over 2. So that's going to be 3.5 pi or 7 pi over 2, 0. So now let's move on to local minimums and local maximums. So local minimums and local maximums. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with our first local minimum. So the first local minimum is right here, which is -9 pi over 4 plus pi over 2. So that's going to give us -9 pi over 4 plus 2 pi over 4. So it's -7 pi over 4, and then it's -2 for the y coordinate. The next local minimum is here. So it's 3 pi over 4 plus pi over 2, which is 2 pi over 4. So it's going to be 5 pi over 4. So 5 pi over 4 and -2. So now we move on to the local maximums. So let's go ahead and find the first local maximum, which is here. So that's -3 pi over 4 plus pi over 2. So negative 3 pi over 4 plus 2 pi over 4. So it's negative pi over 4. So negative pi over 4, and the y coordinate is 2. And then the next maximum is going to be, let's see, I can get my pointer. So the next maximum is 9 pi over 4 plus pi over 2. So that's going to give me 11 pi over 2. So that's going to be 11. Let me go ahead and write it to the side a little bit because this is going to be very small. So the next one here is 11 pi over 4 and 2. So this is the first one right here, and then the second one is right there. And in the next few slides, you will see some monitoring progress problems as well as an exit ticket problem. So please go ahead and work them out on your paper before you move on to look at them, and stop the video every time so you can check your answers. And this was the last slide of lesson 8.4.